Rebecca Martinez stood at the edge of Hangar Bay 7 as the first hum of rotor blades stirred the mountain air at Fort Ridgefield. The morning light caught the row of utility trailers, casting long shadows across the gravel apron. At 0630 hours, the base was still wrapped in that peculiar quiet that comes not from peace, but from military routine, a place built for readiness, where every checklist was treated like gospel and every shortcut had its defender. She moved with deliberate precision, her flight suit zipped clean, the fabric faded at the shoulders from years of wear. Her dark brown hair was braided tightly, the end tucked near the collar of her jacket. Worn leather gloves hung looped through her belt, the same pair she'd used for every pre-flight since certification 3 years ago, molded perfectly to the lines of her palms. Rebecca had never been one to draw attention, but something in the way she carried herself made people step a little wider when passing her on the flight line. There was precision in how she walked, how she scanned the checklist pinned to her tablet, how she paused at the edge of the rotor sweep zone to let the wind pass before approaching any aircraft. The Black Hawk in question sat farther down the tarmac, pulled just inside the edge of Pad 3 with its nose facing west. It looked like any other bird at rest blades folded, surface clean, maintenance tags tucked under a wiper blade. But Rebecca had already seen enough in the morning logs to feel something was off. She'd arrived early to review the paperwork, and what she found had taken her longer to absorb than usual. Not because it was complex, but because it was disturbingly familiar. Torque entries that didn't align with installation times. Signatures from personnel who hadn't been assigned to this airframe that week. Checklists marked complete in 25 minutes when they should have taken 2 hours. It was a pattern she'd flagged before, at a different hangar under a different commanding officer, where a crash 80 months ago had been quietly written off as pilot error. The names had changed. The outcome hadn't. As she walked toward the loading bay where the morning crew was gathered, nobody looked up. A few made space as she reached for the parts manifest, but no one said her name. It didn't bother her anymore. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to make sure aircraft didn't fall out of the sky because someone wanted to shave 50 minutes off a safety check. Chief Master Sergeant Bradley emerged from the dispatch tent, holding a tablet in one hand and coffee in the other. His voice was clipped, his posture military in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. He handed her the assignment with the practiced efficiency of someone passing off a problem. "You're up on this one, Martinez," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Try not to overthink it. We need this bird back in rotation by 1400. She took the tablet without a word, thumbed through the inspection log again, and said nothing. Bradley didn't wait for questions. He never did. One of the junior technicians, a kid named Tyler Collins, walked near her as she moved back toward the Black Hawk. He kept his voice low, just under the whine of a generator spooling up on Bay 2. "They wouldn't give this one to anyone else," he said, eyes still on the crate he was carrying. "Because if something happens up there, it'll read like pilot error, not system failure. You know that, right?" She looked at him, then down at the fastener kit in his hands, then back at the aircraft. The bolts along the tail rotor mount looked too new. The casing showed signs of tool marks that didn't match the log timing. A misalignment no wider than the tip of her finger stood out at the top brace. Enough to cause vibration. Enough to become catastrophic if the system passed. Power through the wrong sequence under load. She gave him a single nod. "I know." Tyler didn't say anything else. He just walked off faster than before, leaving her alone with the machine that nobody else would touch. Rebecca approached the aircraft slowly, feeling the vibration of warming. Rotors on another bird resonating through her boots. She reached the port side panel and brushed her hand across the surface. Dust near the intake had been wiped, but not by someone who cared about the pattern. just enough to make it look clean from a distance. Her gloves stayed looped at her belt. She would only put them on once she trusted the frame. The aircraft's belly panel bore a thin scratch near the latch, not from wear, but from a hasty tool drag. She knelt, tapped the casing once with the side of her hand, listening to the echo. Everything told her not to fly this bird. And yet, she knew that refusing the assignment would cement what they already thought of her. Difficult, disruptive, the pilot who said no too often. The one who got in the way of progress. She had spent years building a reputation for precision, not heroics. For discipline, not drama. But as she stood there in the morning light, watching the shadows shift across the concrete, Rebecca realized that sometimes staying silent was the most dangerous choice of all. The gloves came off her belt, fingers sliding in without hesitation. She reached for the latch on the cockpit door and pulled it open, stepping into the machine that no one else would touch, not because she trusted it, but because she needed to know exactly what they were hiding. As she settled into the pilot's seat and began the engine start sequence, one thought echoed in her mind. If this bird was going to fail, she was going to make sure everyone knew why. The blades began to turn, cutting the morning air with mechanical precision, and Rebecca Martinez prepared to discover just how deep the corruption at Fort Ridgefield really went. The Black Hawk lifted clean off Pad 3 at 0745 hours, its rotors cutting through the calm morning air with steady rhythm. Rebecca adjusted the cyclic pressure with her left hand and set her boots evenly on the pedals, feeling the first response of the airframe as it rose through the mountain air. Fort Ridgefield fell away beneath her, the tan ridgeline curving out toward the timber cut beyond the base perimeter. She reached 300 meters and held for stability, letting the system settle before initiating the transition run. Inside the cockpit, morning light played across the instrument panels, while blade shadows slid in brief passes over the glass, over her gloved hands, over the faded strip of checklist tape that ran below the fuel readout. She noted vibration slight, tolerable, not unusual for a bird just out of maintenance. Still, her focus never softened. She'd flown enough hours to know that the first 5 minutes told the real story of any machine. The headset sat tight against her ears. She kept the microphone live, not transmitting but recording, a habit from earlier years when nobody believed her logs unless she had proof. Her breathing stayed controlled, one exhale every 4 seconds. Body controlled the tone. Tone controlled the frame. Altitude 400 meters. Climb rate steady. Instrument feedback green across the board. She made the turn northwest, adjusting yaw slowly to keep the torque line clean. That was when it happened. The vibration changed, not increased, just shifted. A lateral pulse began beneath her left boot, like a fault in the tail rotor assembly. The trim reading blinked once, nothing flagging red. Then the hydraulic pressure gauge twitched just enough to draw her eye. She steadied her hand and kept climbing. Altitude 500 meters. Then the engine data stuttered. One by one, gauges began to contradict themselves. The forward power reading dipped below load specifications, even as the torque indicator climbed. The vibration grew sharper, but the alert system stayed quiet. Then the pressure gauge did something she'd never seen before. It spun backward. Not fast, just steady, like it had lost its sensor tether and reversed the signal curve entirely. Rebecca didn't speak into the headset. Instead, she reached for the control bus switch and cut it hard. The system blinked once, then dropped. Screens dimmed. The auto stabilizers disconnected with a low mechanical thunk. The aircraft pitched slightly left. Her grip tightened on the controls. She didn't wait for warnings. She didn't trust what the computer would tell her next. Instead, she reached for the mechanical failsafe handle behind the throttle column and locked the trim manually. The Black Hawk drifted, catching air like a loose sheet, then started to settle. Altitude 600 meters. Drop beginning. She adjusted pitch with a half pull, leaned into the cyclic, and felt the airframe resist and comply. An alert chirped, electrical fault. Then a second, auxiliary power false load. None of it matched what she was actually feeling through the controls. She glanced at the side panel. The engine temperature readout showed a steady climb, but external cooling pressure had flatlined completely. "Rebecca," she whispered, voice just above breath. Manual override engaged. Full systems conflict. Control mismatch. The headset recorder clicked once as it captured her words. She didn't call ground control, not yet. She didn't trust what would be waiting on the other end. Altitude falling fast now. 500 meters. Wind coming up from the east. She adjusted to compensate, kicked the tail gently, and set angle for auto rotation entry. The frame protested. She coaxed it through, keeping her hands firm but never locking her elbows. The aircraft bucked once. She shifted her weight forward in the seat, leaned into the control line, and held steady. The right side display blinked red. Engine 1 overheating, but the indicator was being fed reverse telemetry. The system wasn't just braking. It was lying. "Electrical data is fake," she whispered again. "Gauge spin is manual loop. This isn't damage. This is scripted." Another warning sounded. Hydraulic loss, full panel alert. But the actual feedback through the control stick said otherwise. She was still flying a machine that wanted to live, but was being told to die. Altitude 200 meters. She eased into final approach position. The base was below the ridgeline now, half obscured by morning mist. She had no idea if they could see her descent or not. She didn't care. Her breathing stayed even. She counted the wind bounce 2 cross gusts, both manageable. She flared early to compensate for engine lag. The landing wouldn't be elegant, but it would be clean. At 80 meters, she adjusted pitch again. The nose dipped, the tail fluttered once, then held. She brought the bird down in the controlled arc. Touched rear wheels first, then forward. Let the weight settle before cutting engine supply. The rotor spun down with no damage, no alarms, just a settling tick of metal under stress release. The headset kept recording. She sat still for a moment, hands resting on the console, breath steady, sweat cold behind her collar. Then she leaned toward the recorder and spoke just once, her voice as calm as it had been throughout the entire emergency landing. "It's not a failure. It's bait." No one came to the cockpit immediately. No vehicle approached from the tower. From inside the shell of the machine, she heard nothing but rotor blades coasting to rest. No ground crew, no control tower check-in, no questions. Only her voice on the recorder and the machine that had tried to lie her out of the sky. As she finally powered down the last systems and prepared to step out, Rebecca knew with absolute certainty that what had just happened was no accident. Someone had wanted this bird to fail. The only question now was whether they wanted it to fail with her in it. The rotors had barely stopped spinning when Rebecca stepped down from the cockpit, her boots hitting the tarmac with steady pressure. No one met her at the bird. The open ramp beyond Pad 3 was empty. No ground chief, no clipboard, no standard post-flight questions. She waited, scanning the area. Through the tower window, she caught a flicker of movement, someone pulling a blind closed. Inside the operations tent, a young airman walked briskly toward her, head tilted just enough to suggest urgency, but avoiding eye contact entirely. He held a sealed folder, the kind used for incident damage logs. He didn't speak, just handed it off, turned and walked in the opposite direction without breaking stride. Rebecca opened the folder slowly. The form inside had already been signed, but not by her. Her name was printed on the pilot line, but the signature didn't belong to her. It was initialed by Chief Master Sergeant Bradley. The flight was marked complete. No deviation, no anomalies reported. Her logbook, which should have been waiting with the aircraft maintenance officer, was nowhere in sight. She took one step toward the operations tent, but Bradley stepped out before she reached it. His coffee was fresh. His expression gave nothing away. "There's no need to file anything additional," he said. "We're handling it internally." She didn't answer. He didn't wait for one. That evening at 20:30 hours, Rebecca sat in her quarters reviewing the day's events. Her flight recorder, the personal backup she kept separate from aircraft systems, contained 37 minutes of audio documenting every gauge malfunction, every false reading, every moment when the Black Hawk systems had lied to her. She'd transcribed the key moments: the pressure gauge spinning backward, the temperature warnings for systems running cool, the electrical faults that triggered while power remained steady. It painted a clear picture of deliberate sabotage disguised as equipment failure. A soft knock interrupted her work. She opened the door to find Tyler Collins standing there, still in his maintenance coveralls, looking nervously over his shoulder. "I shouldn't be doing this," he said quietly, "but you need to see something." He handed her a manila envelope, then turned and walked down the corridor without waiting for thanks. Inside were printed maintenance logs, real ones, with printer. Smudges still visible. Timestamps that hadn't been scrubbed clean yet. She laid them out one after another. Safety approvals claiming full diagnostics were completed in 20 minutes. Pre-flight checks signed off before crews had even arrived on site. Names logged for technicians who had been on temporary duty assignments during the dates in question. Each record aligned perfectly with her own flight data and the telemetry from her headset recording. This wasn't sloppiness or corner cutting. This was choreographed deception. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, studying the pattern. 3 other aircraft had cycled through the same expedited maintenance process in the past month. One had been grounded after a training flight reported minor electrical anomalies. Another had been transferred to a different base before its next scheduled inspection. The third was scheduled to fly tomorrow morning at 0800 hours with a full crew of 4. She looked down at the circuit board documentation Tyler had included, technical specifications for a component that had been officially recalled 18 months earlier due to critical failure risks under load stress. According to these logs, that same recalled part was currently installed in active aircraft throughout the base. Someone wasn't just cutting corners on maintenance. They were actively installing defective components and falsifying records to cover it up. The only question was how high up the chain of command this corruption reached. Rebecca gathered the documents and placed them in a secure envelope. She had a choice to make: stay quiet and hope the problem solved itself, or take action knowing it would likely end her career at Fort Ridgefield. She thought about the crew scheduled to fly tomorrow, about the 18 families who had lost loved ones in the crash. She'd investigated at her previous assignment, the one officially blamed on pilot error that she now suspected had similar causes. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She sealed the envelope and prepared to make the call that would change everything. But first, she needed to gather more evidence. If she was going to expose this conspiracy, she needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up. As she prepared for what might be her last night at Fort Ridgefield, Rebecca Martinez had no idea that her quiet act of courage was about to uncover a network of corruption that stretched far beyond one mountain base in Colorado. At 0300 hours, Fort Ridgefield settled into the kind of deep quiet that only comes after lights out. Cargo crates were secured, tool lockers double-chained, and the lights in the dining facility had clicked off one by one. By 0310, the hangar rows were dark except for a single security light near the service entrance. Rebecca moved through the shadows using her maintenance badge and an old access code that hadn't been updated in her clearance rotation. She'd specifically avoided requesting the code change, knowing that someday she might need unrestricted access to aircraft outside normal duty hours. Tonight was that someday. She walked through the familiar scent of aviation grease and cool concrete, past the sealed oxygen tanks and spill containment cabinets, straight to the Black Hawk she'd flown earlier. It sat deeper in the bay now, pulled past the lift doors and tagged for routine clearance, which meant it would be cleaned, documented, and returned to service without deeper investigation. She approached silently, her phone's camera ready. The panels were closed, the cockpit secured, but she wasn't here for the obvious evidence. She needed the hidden proof. Walking around to the tail section first, she examined the mount bracket where she'd felt the abnormal vibration during flight. There was a misalignment between the upper mount bracket and access panel, no more than 2 millimeters offset. Enough to shift under pressure, enough to fracture under sustained load. She photographed it from 3 angles, then moved to the central access panel beneath the avionics housing. The latch resisted briefly, then gave way. Inside, the wiring. Harness looked clean at first glance, except it was too clean. The connector crimps showed fresh tool impressions. The bolt heads had tiny scoring marks. Someone had opened this panel multiple times recently. Her gloved fingers moved with practiced precision. She detached the housing, eased the main relay unit from its bracket, and flipped it over. There, printed in small block letters, was the component identifier, XM7741. She recognized it immediately. This was the exact component from the recall notice she'd flagged 18 months ago. The one with documented failure patterns that caused delayed current spikes under climb torque conditions. The same conditions that had nearly killed her during today's flight. According to Defense Department regulations, this part should have been removed from all active aircraft and destroyed. Instead, it was installed, active, and hidden under a fresh inspection label. She photographed the component from every angle, then carefully documented the false labeling, the installation date discrepancies, and the missing serial number that should have been logged in the maintenance database. Moving to the workbench area, she found additional evidence. A folded maintenance log from the previous week showing that the relay installation she'd just photographed didn't officially exist. There was no paper trail, no work order, no signature. Approval for installing critical flight components. Rebecca spent the next hour methodically documenting every irregularity she could find. Torque specifications that didn't match manufacturer requirements. Safety wire installations that were purely cosmetic. Inspection stamps that had been applied before inspections were actually completed. By 0430, she had 47 photographs and detailed notes covering systematic maintenance fraud that put every pilot on the base at risk. But she also knew that evidence could disappear as quickly as it had been created. She needed insurance. Back in her quarters, Rebecca uploaded everything to an encrypted folder on a secure server outside the military network. She created 3 identical copies of all documentation, sealed them in separate packages, and addressed them to different oversight authorities: the Inspector General's Office, the Defense Safety Board, and a contact at the Government Accountability Office she'd worked with during her previous corruption investigation. 2 of the packages would be mailed through civilian postal services off base. The 3rd would be hand-delivered only if something happened to her. As dawn approached, she made one final preparation. She wrote a detailed timeline of events, signed and dated it, and placed it in her personal safe along with copies of all evidence. If anyone tried to claim she was fabricating allegations or acting from personal grievance, the documentation trail would prove otherwise. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from Tyler. 0800 flight canceled. Crew called in. Sick, all 4 of them. Rebecca smiled grimly. At least someone else was paying attention. The crew scheduled to fly the next maintenance fraud aircraft had somehow gotten word that it wasn't safe. Whether through official channels or the unofficial network that kept good soldiers alive, the information was spreading. But canceling one flight wouldn't solve the underlying problem. And she knew that once her investigation became known, the cover-up efforts would intensify dramatically. She had maybe 24 hours before Bradley and his superiors realized what she'd discovered. After that, it would be her word against a system designed to protect itself. As Rebecca prepared for what might be the most important day of her military career, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for her own vindication anymore. She was fighting for every pilot who would climb into these aircraft, trusting that someone else had done their job honestly. The evidence was gathered. The documentation was secure. Now came the hardest part, making sure the right people saw it before the wrong people made it disappear. At 0600 hours, Rebecca walked into the base communications center, carrying a sealed priority envelope addressed to the Department of Defense Inspector General. The duty officer, a young sergeant named Williams, processed it without question. Routine correspondence from Fort Ridgefield to Washington happened daily. What wasn't routine was the contents. 47 photographs, detailed technical analysis, audio recordings, and a 12-page incident report documenting systematic maintenance fraud that endangered every aircraft on the base. She'd also included a specific request: immediate grounding of all aircraft that had undergone expedited maintenance in the past 90 days, pending independent safety inspection by personnel not assigned to Fort Ridgefield. By 0800, Chief Bradley was standing outside her quarters, with 2 military police escorts and a very different expression than she'd seen before. "Martinez, you're needed in the conference room," he said. His voice carried an edge that hadn't been there during previous conversations. "Bring any personal documentation related to yesterday's flight." She looked at the MPs, both of whom avoided eye contact. "Am I under some kind of investigation, Chief?" "Just bring your materials and come with us." The conference room contained 5 people she'd never seen before. 3 in Air Force dress uniforms with ranks she couldn't immediately identify. 1 civilian in a dark suit, and Colonel Harrison, the base commander, who looked like he hadn't slept. Bradley took a seat at the far end of the table. The civilian opened a leather portfolio and spoke first. "Captain Martinez, I'm David Richardson from the Judge Advocate General's office. We understand you've made some serious allegations regarding maintenance procedures at this facility." She remained standing. "I've documented safety violations and fraudulent maintenance records." "Yes, sir." "These are very serious charges," one of the uniformed officers said. "Charges that could damage the reputation of this base and the careers of several personnel if they prove unfounded." "They're not unfounded," Rebecca replied evenly. "I have complete documentation." Richardson leaned forward. "We'd like to review your materials before any external communications take place. Give us the opportunity to investigate internally before involving outside authorities." The trap was obvious, but she'd expected it. "I appreciate the opportunity, sir, but given the nature of the safety risks involved, I've already forwarded my findings to the appropriate oversight authorities. Pilots' lives are at stake." The room went very quiet. Colonel Harrison cleared his throat. "Captain, you understand that premature disclosure of unsubstantiated allegations could constitute insubordination, conduct prejudicial to good order, and discipline or even violations of operational security." Rebecca had prepared for this moment. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her folder and placed it on the table. "Sir, with respect, I've documented my actions in accordance with Air Force Instruction 90-301, which requires immediate reporting of safety hazards, depose imminent danger to personnel, I followed proper channels and documented everything according to regulations. She'd spent hours the night before reviewing the exact regulatory language. They couldn't discipline her for following Air Force safety reporting requirements, even if they didn't like the timing or the scope of her report. Richardson made notes on his pad. Captain Martinez, we're prepared to offer you a transfer to another assignment while this matter is investigated. A clean transition that protects your career interests. The offer was tempting a way out that would let her maintain her military standing while someone else dealt with the corruption she'd uncovered. But she thought about the crew that had called in sick rather than fly a potentially sabotaged aircraft. About the 18 families from her previous base. About every pilot who would trust these maintenance logs in the coming weeks. I respectfully decline, sir. I'd prefer to remain available to assist with any investigation into these safety violations. The civilian and the uniformed officers exchanged glances. Colonel Harrison spoke up. Captain, you're hereby relieved of flight duties pending the outcome of this investigation. You'll report to Administrative Services for alternate assignment. She'd expected this too. Understood, sir. As she turned to leave, Richardson called after her. Captain Martinez, I hope you understand the seriousness of the path you've chosen. False allegations against superior officers can have severe consequences for your military career. Rebecca paused at the door and looked back at the room full of men who seemed more concerned about protecting reputations than protecting lives. Sir, I'm not making allegations against officers. I'm documenting maintenance fraud that nearly killed me and could kill others. The evidence speaks for itself. She left the conference room knowing that her military career at Fort Ridgefield was effectively over. But as she walked back to her quarters, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your report received. Investigation team en route. Maintain all documentation. IG office. For the first time in days, Rebecca Martinez allowed herself a small smile. The fight was just beginning, but at least now she wasn't fighting alone. 3 hours later, Tyler Collins approached her near the commissary, glancing around nervously before speaking. They've called in a full maintenance stand-down, he said quietly. All aircraft grounded pending routine inspection updates. Word? Is that someone from Washington is flying in tomorrow? The system was starting to respond. Whether it would respond with reform or with retaliation remained to be seen. The sound started low, like distant wind dragged across the mountain ridge. At 0558 hours, the first helicopter crossed into Fort Ridgefield airspace running silent with no identification beacons. By 0600, 11 more had followed, approaching from staggered vectors with synchronized precision that spoke of military coordination far above base level. Rebecca stood near the fuel depot, arms crossed, watching each aircraft descend. The rotors chopped through the early morning fog, slicing long shadows across the tarmac as they settled into formation. These weren't regular transport birds, they were configured for command and investigation, with extended communication arrays and personnel compartments designed for document security. The aircraft didn't land on designated pads. They came down in rows, blocking vehicle access lanes and forming a protective perimeter around the maintenance facilities. Doors opened in unison. Personnel in dark utility uniforms disembarked with mechanical efficiency 12 from each helicopter, moving in coordinated units. No visible insignia, only encrypted patches and the kind of professional bearing that came from serious federal authority. 3 teams broke immediately toward the southern gate, sealing it with magnetic locks. 2 more moved to the flight operations office and began disconnecting external servers. A technical team of 4 took position at the communications hub, implementing what appeared to be a complete digital lockdown. Within minutes, base terminals froze, printers cut off mid-page, and the internal wireless network went dark. Inside the command center, the base operations chief barked into a dead headset while staff scrambled to understand what was happening. Chief Bradley emerged from Hangar 3, carrying his morning coffee when two federal investigators approached him. They said nothing, simply extended a folded document and waited. Bradley's face went rigid as he read, his eyes scanning for backup. Support that wasn't coming. The message was clear. Compliance wasn't being requested. By 0620, every aircraft on the flight schedule was officially grounded. Fueling operations ceased. Crates staged for outbound shipment were marked with red security tags. Even an automated maintenance drone attempting to taxi to the north pad was remotely overridden and powered down. No alarm sounded. No one raised voices. It didn't feel like a raid. It felt like accountability arriving with methodical precision. From her position near the fuel depot, Rebecca watched as a sealed maintenance locker outside Pad 6 was opened by investigators wearing thermal gloves. They carried no weapons, only diagnostic scanners and sealed evidence bags. She could see one of them photographing an access panel, while another used a field spectrometer to analyze recent tool markings. She had flagged that exact panel in her documentation. One helicopter remained airborne, hovering above the operations yard. Its rotor wash swirled dust through the service lanes below, while the base commander stood flanked by two federal observers with data tablets. Rebecca didn't recognize either of them. Their uniforms weren't standard Air Force issue. A figure in black tactical gear crossed the yard at a deliberate pace. He stopped halfway between the depot and the central operations trailer, turned slightly, and made eye contact with Rebecca across the distance. He didn't salute or speak. He simply nodded once, a professional acknowledgement between people who understood the stakes. Her phone buzzed quietly. The message was brief. XM741 confirmed. Other installations compromised. Documentation verified. Thank you. No name, no return number, no signature required. Inside the command center, her audio recordings were already being analyzed against black box data recovered from 6 recent aircraft incidents across 3 different bases. The waveform signatures matched. So did the patterns of false indicators and reversed instrument readings she documented. The corruption wasn't limited to Fort Ridgefield. In Hangar 7, an investigator opened a maintenance supply drawer labeled for standard harness tools. Inside were spare relay components, 5 marked with filed-off serial numbers, one of them halfway through being relabeled for installation. A forensic specialist cataloged each item with quiet thoroughness. The names on the supply inventory didn't match the assignment logs. The components were all XM741 variants that should have been destroyed 18 months ago. By 0700, 4 base personnel were in federal custody. 2 civilian contractors had been escorted off-site under sealed orders. The procurement database for spare flight components had been disconnected and secured for forensic analysis. The manufacturer responsible for XM7741 components was flagged red across the entire defense logistics network. Rebecca remained by the fuel depot, unmoving. She didn't need to say anything. She had already said enough through her documentation, her photographs, and the audio recordings that had provided the evidence trail investigators needed. Behind her, the morning sky began to lighten as the last operational helicopter settled onto Pad 5. Rotor blades ticked slowly to a stop while someone inside the command trailer switched off the final circuit breaker on the base communication system. Every monitor went dark. No more network access, no more data strings. Everything the investigators needed was already secured. Rebecca looked down at her phone one more time. The message was still there, unchanged. She didn't smile or feel vindicated. She simply turned away from the landing pad and walked back toward the hangar. The sound of her boots on concrete was steady beneath the long echo of rotors winding down. Justice had arrived quietly, professionally, and with the kind of thoroughness that left no room for cover-ups or convenient explanations. The conspiracy she'd uncovered was bigger than one base, bigger than a few corrupt maintenance personnel. But it had started to unravel the moment she'd refused to stay silent about a machine that had tried to lie her out of the sky. By the third day, the investigation had transformed Fort Ridgefield into something unrecognizable. The helicopters were gone, but their impact remained in the form of sealed offices, restricted access zones, and a base-wide silence that felt heavier than morning fog. Rebecca sat in a small conference room across from Special Agent Catherine Wells from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. Between them lay 3 thick folders containing evidence that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning multiple military installations. "Captain Martinez," Agent Wells said, reviewing her notes, "your initial report has led us to similar maintenance fraud at 6 other Air Force bases. We've identified 43 aircraft with unauthorized XM741 components, falsified inspection records dating back 2 years, and a procurement network that was systematically installing recalled parts for profit." Rebecca nodded but said nothing. She'd learned that investigators preferred facts to commentary. "The audio recording from your flight has been particularly valuable," Wells continued. "It's the first real-time documentation we have of these systems failing under operational conditions. Combined with your technical analysis, it provides clear evidence of criminal negligence." Agent Wells opened the second folder. "Chief Master Sergeant Bradley has been relieved of duty and is facing charges of fraud, conspiracy, and endangering military personnel. The civilian contractors involved in parts procurement are facing federal prosecution. Colonel Harrison is under administrative review for failure to maintain adequate oversight." Rebecca had mixed feelings about Harrison. He'd been manipulated by the system beneath him, but he'd also been too quick to protect the base's reputation rather than investigate her concerns. "What we need from you now," Wells said, "is testimony before a military tribunal. Your expertise and first-hand experience will be crucial for establishing the technical aspects of this conspiracy." "Of course," Rebecca replied. "Whatever you need." Wells smiled slightly, the first personal expression she'd shown during their meeting. "Captain, I want you to understand something. What you did took considerable courage. A lot of people in your position would have filed a routine report and let someone else deal with the consequences. I couldn't do that," Rebecca said simply. "People's lives were at stake. Yes, they were. And because of your actions, we've prevented what could have been multiple catastrophic accidents. The investigation team estimates that without your intervention, we would have seen aircraft failures within the next 60 days." That evening, Rebecca walked the flight line alone for the first time in weeks. Most of the aircraft remained grounded, but maintenance crews were working under direct federal oversight to inspect and repair every bird that had been compromised. Honest technicians like Tyler Collins were working double shifts to rebuild trust in the systems that kept pilots alive. Her phone buzzed with a message from her former commanding officer at Peterson Air Force Base. "Heard about Fort Ridgefield. Proud of you, Martinez. Takes integrity to do what you did." Similar messages had been arriving throughout the week from pilots and maintenance personnel across the Air Force. Word had spread through the informal networks that kept military aviation safe, the quiet conversations between crews who understood that their lives depended on people doing their jobs honestly. Tyler Collins approached her near Hangar 7, no longer looking over his shoulder nervously. The investigation had created space for honest personnel to speak openly about problems they'd noticed but felt powerless to address. "Captain," he said, "I wanted to thank you. A lot of us knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how to prove it or who to trust with the information." "You helped more than you know," Rebecca replied. That envelope you brought me contained the evidence that broke the case open. Tyler nodded toward the maintenance bay, where federal investigators were still working. They found 17 more XM7741 components in the supply system. Components that were supposed to have been destroyed. Some of them were scheduled for installation next week. The scope of the conspiracy was still being uncovered. Each day brought new evidence of systematic fraud that had put hundreds of pilots at risk across multiple installations. What happens next? Tyler asked. Rebecca looked at the aircraft under repair, their panels open, their systems being rebuilt by technicians who could finally work without pressure to cut corners or ignore safety protocols. Next, we make sure this never happens again, she said. The following morning, Agent Wells called Rebecca into a final debriefing session. The conference room table was covered with documents, photographs, and technical reports that represented the most comprehensive investigation into military maintenance fraud in recent Air Force history. The tribunal begins next week. Wells sighed. Your testimony will be the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But I wanted to give you an update on the broader impact of this investigation. She opened the folder marked with Department of Defense seals. Based on your findings, the Air Force is implementing new safety protocols across all installations. Independent oversight for critical maintenance procedures. Mandatory reporting systems for safety concerns. And most importantly, protection for personnel who report suspected violations. Rebecca felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The changes would mean that future pilots like her wouldn't have to risk their careers to protect their fellow service members. There's something else, Wells continued. The Air Force Safety Center wants to offer you a position as a safety investigator. You'd be working cases like this one, ensuring that maintenance standards are maintained across the service. The offer was unexpected, but made sense. Her technical expertise, combined with her proven willingness to pursue difficult investigations, would be valuable in preventing future incidents. I'd like to think about it, Rebecca said. Of course, take your time. As Rebecca left the conference room, she passed Chief Bradley in handcuffs being escorted to a federal transport vehicle. He looked up as she walked by, his expression a mixture of anger and resignation. This could have been handled quietly, he said. No one had to get hurt. Rebecca stopped and looked at him directly. Chief, people were already getting hurt. They just weren't people you cared about protecting. She continued walking, leaving him to face the consequences of choices that had prioritized convenience over safety, profit over people's lives. That evening, Rebecca stood on the flight line one final time as a pilot stationed at Fort Ridgefield. Tomorrow she would testify before the tribunal, and within weeks she would either transfer to her new assignment or leave the Air Force entirely. But tonight, she watched as the first aircraft cleared for flight operations lifted off. Pad 3, the same pad where her own nightmare flight had begun. This time, the bird rose smoothly into the evening sky, its systems functioning as designed, maintained by technicians who could do their jobs honestly. The corruption had been exposed. The criminals would face justice. The system would be reformed. And somewhere tonight, pilots across the Air Force would climb into aircraft they could trust, protected by maintenance procedures that prioritized their safety over bureaucratic convenience. For Captain Rebecca Martinez, that knowledge was worth every risk she had taken. 6 months later, Rebecca Martinez stood in a different hangar at a different base, wearing the same worn flight gloves and carrying the same precision that had defined her career. But her role had changed completely. As the Air Force's newest senior safety investigator, she was no longer the person raising concerns about unsafe aircraft. She was the person others called when those concerns needed to be investigated. Her office walls were lined with technical manuals, safety bulletins, and a single framed photograph. the XM7741 circuit board that had nearly killed her and dozens of other pilots. It served as a daily reminder of what happened when people prioritized convenience over safety. Her phone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for priority calls. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Janet Rivera, a new commanding officer at the Air Force Safety Center. "Rebecca, we've got a situation at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. 3 separate incidents involving hydraulic system anomalies during training flights. All different aircraft, all different crews, but similar failure patterns." Rebecca was already reaching for her travel bag. "Falsified maintenance records? That's what we need you to determine. How soon can you be there? I can be airborne in 2 hours." As she prepared for another investigation, Rebecca reflected on how much had changed since that morning at Fort Ridgefield. The tribunal had resulted in federal convictions for 6 people involved in the maintenance fraud conspiracy. Chief Bradley was serving 4 years in federal prison. The civilian contractors who had profited from installing defective parts faced even longer sentences. More importantly, the Air Force had implemented the safety reforms Agent Wells had mentioned. Anonymous reporting systems allowed personnel to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Independent oversight teams rotated between bases to audit maintenance procedures. And mandatory safety training emphasized that protecting lives was always more important than protecting reputations. Tyler Collins had been promoted and was now leading an honest maintenance team at Fort Ridgefield. He sent Rebecca regular updates on the improvements they'd implemented, double verification procedures for critical components, cross-training programs that prevented any single person from controlling safety decisions, and a base culture that rewarded thoroughness over speed. The aircraft she'd flown during that terrifying flight had become a training tool, permanently grounded and used to teach maintenance personnel about the real-world consequences of cutting corners. Students learned to identify the subtle signs of fraud that Rebecca had documented: misaligned components, fresh tool marks on old installations, and documentation inconsistencies that reveal systematic deception. Her story had become part of Air Force safety training, though her name was rarely mentioned. She preferred it that way. The focus should be on the lessons learned, not the individual who had learned them. As Rebecca boarded the transport aircraft that would take her to Montana, she thought about the letter she'd received the previous week from a young pilot at Kadena Air Base in Japan. The pilot had noticed irregularities in his aircraft's maintenance logs and had filed a safety report rather than staying silent. His concerns had led to the discovery of improper part sourcing that could have caused in-flight emergencies. "I read about the Fort Ridgefield investigation," the pilot had written. "It gave me the courage to speak up when I saw something wrong. Thank you for showing us that doing the right thing is always worth the risk." Similar letters arrived regularly from across the Air Force pilots, mechanics, and safety personnel who had been inspired to prioritize integrity over convenience, because they'd learned about someone who had faced the same choice and chosen correctly. The transport aircraft lifted off into clear skies, its systems functioning perfectly under the oversight of the reformed maintenance procedures that had emerged from Rebecca's investigation. As they climbed toward cruising altitude, she opened her case files and began reviewing the technical specifications for the hydraulic systems she would be investigating in Montana. Somewhere below, other pilots were making routine flights in aircraft they could trust. Maintenance personnel were following safety protocols that protected lives rather than schedules. Base commanders were prioritizing mission safety over mission convenience. The changes weren't perfect, and there would always be new challenges to address. But the culture had shifted in a fundamental way. The system now protected the people who protected others, rather than silencing them. Rebecca had never intended to become a symbol of military integrity. She had simply been a pilot who refused to ignore evidence that could save lives. But as she prepared for another investigation that might prevent another tragedy, she understood that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in the sky, but in the quiet moments when individuals choose between what's easy and what's right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Wells, who had become both a colleague and a friend. Saw the news about Malmstrom. Go get them, Captain. The service needs people like you. Rebecca smiled and returned to her case files. There was work to do, aircraft to investigate, and lives to protect. She had found her true calling not in flying the missions, but in ensuring that every pilot who flew them had the same chance she'd fought for during that terrifying flight above Fort Ridgefield, the chance to trust their aircraft, their maintenance teams, and their chain of command. As the transport leveled off at 35,000 feet, Captain Rebecca Martinez began preparing for another day of making sure that integrity, not convenience, would determine who came home safely. The sky was clear ahead, and the mission was just beginning. This story reminds us that courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's as quiet as a pilot who refuses to ignore warning signs, or as simple as choosing to document the truth, even when others prefer comfortable lies. Rebecca Martinez never sought recognition. She only sought to ensure that the next person in her position would have a real chance of coming home safely. Her legacy lives not in commendations or headlines, but in the reformed systems that now protect pilots across the Air Force, and in the culture of integrity that her example helped create. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying silent and doing what's right? Share your experiences in the comments. Your stories of courage and integrity inspire others to stand up when it matters most. For more incredible true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, check out our playlist of real-life heroes. And if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters, no matter how powerful the system they're facing.